All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 8, Selling Radio Advertising. Radio has long been known as the theater of the mind. It's radio's unique contribution to mass media, especially when we're talking about traditional media. Of course, we know podcasts are kind of in this realm as well. As we talk about things, though, like radio versus TV versus print, theater of the mind really comes to mind when we talk about radio, especially the history of radio as it's come through the ages. Jack Trout says radio is pure sound. To do good radio, you have to understand how to use sound and sound effects. Bill Burton says radio is an ideal sales vehicle to stretch the imagination as well as the mind. So all these things talking about how the aspect of what we hear as listeners comes to us, and then we have to picture for ourselves what it is that we're hearing really represents if we were to somehow actually see that. So we visualize that in our minds. So radio in that sense actually makes our mind work in such a way that it gets us involved in the medium to the point where we're kind of participating in how we tell the story by the way that we interpret the story that is coming to us. John Emmerling says that the rewards of selling radio in the age of television's 10, 15, and 30-second spotlets include the fact that radio still offers an affordable 60 seconds. And in that long, luxurious time span, you can involve a listener. So you have a whole lot more time than a lot of different other forms of media and the advertising time that they offer in order for you to be able to develop a narrative, to be able to describe what it is that you want to convey to the listener. And that is a very powerful thing. Emmerling also cited radio's audience segmentation, low production costs, and speed of production as key benefits to the medium. They add up to flexibility that let you take quick advantage of momentary changes in a marketing situation. So you have all these different elements that basically allow radio to kind of be the last minute hero of a lot of different advertising needs. When something needs to change on a dime, it can happen. You can do it with very short notice. You can do it at a relatively low cost compared to what it would take to revise and edit and schedule a television commercial, for example. So radio has that power of efficiency both in timeliness and in cost effectiveness. Some other benefits of radio as an advertising medium: it has two major selling points. The first one is flexibility. Radio is ready to create an announcement at a moment's notice to help the advertiser. We just talked about that. And we also talked about this one, mind pictures. Only radio leaves it to the hearer to create the image conjured up by the words. So you add those two things together, and it creates that idea that we think of radio as a rather intimate sort of medium. As a matter of fact, Gary Fry says radio's unique attribute is intimacy with the customer. So you have that aspect. We've talked about in other classes how radio allows for the person behind the microphone to present his or her material in such a way that he or she can make it seem like they're talking to just one person. And for the announcer to be able to do that effectively helps to create that intimate, warm sense of what radio can offer. And the flexibility and the mind pictures and all that really kind of helps to bolster that as well, in that you do have active participation from the listener, and you have the fact that because of all the things that we've talked about, that radio can change course, it can provide a different message, different programming, different advertisements, almost on demand. Some of the statistics in your book are a little outdated. I've updated these for you, looking at the website for the Radio Advertising Bureau. 92% of those age 18 plus listen to radio on a weekly basis. The average 12 plus listener spends about 12.4 hours listening weekly. You can imagine a lot of that time is going to be commuting time. Matter of fact, 77.8% of people listen to radio in their cars. 1 in 3 listen to terrestrial radio online. So it's not just the fact that people are listening online, but they're actually listening to bona fide radio stations when they pull up their favorite listening app. In the minority cultures, 21 million African Americans, that's 57% of the African American population, listens to radio weekly, and 60% of Hispanics in the U.S. listen to radio on a weekly basis. Some other attributes that make radio attractive to advertisers. Radio has a wide array of formats to reach listeners during a receptive state of mind, which can complement a specific advertising message. So the idea here is that when people listen to radio, they're tuning in to their favorite station, or they're tuning in for content that they are excited or passionate about, stuff that appeals to them. And when you listen to something that appeals to you, you're going to be in a rather positive state when you're listening to it, at least in terms of the media that you're consuming. Therefore, when you have advertising on a particular radio station, the idea is that that positive frame of mind as the listener is listening to their favorite content, that will carry over as it goes into the commercial break time. Radio allows delivery of its messages to multiple household members simultaneously. Radio is intrusive. Listeners have to make a conscious effort not to hear a radio commercial. Now, a lot of people are willing to hit that scan button once they hear a commercial break come on, but it is a conscious choice that people do that when they do so. Otherwise, if people just leave the radio on, perhaps if they're doing something else while they're listening, well, those ads are going to interrupt. They're going to invade. They're going to be intrusive. So they're there. Radio advertising can be purchased nationally, regionally, or locally. So it can appeal to any size business that wants to get their message out. Radio produces high frequency levels, which enhance effective reach. We'll talk a little bit more about frequency and reach a little bit later on, but basically it's the idea that when you're heard on radio, you could be heard by a significant number of people, and your message could be heard by those people multiple times. Radio is cost efficient, I should say. It offers low cost per commercial announcement and the lowest production cost. A radio commercial conjures the visual elements of a television commercial using imagery transfer. So the idea here with imagery transfer is that if you recognize a advertiser from television, the branding, the logos, some of the people that are spokespeople for that particular company, those images stay with you, and you will carry those images with you when you hear the ad for the same company on a radio station. So it has that sense of memory and association, which makes the message on radio that much stronger. The radio commercial can produce images by using the listener's imagination. Again, theater of the mind. Now, with all those positives, there are some negatives as well about radio advertising. Radio is often considered a background medium because the listener can do something else at the same time. So on one hand, we talk about how it's intimate and that people have to listen and be able to participate with creating the mind pictures. But radio is also such that you could have it on in the background, while you're working, while you're reading, while you're doing things around the house, whatever it is that you happen to be doing. And it might not be the most forefront in terms of commanding your attention. Radio requires high levels of frequency to a schedule. You have to air a spot several times in order for it to be able to effectively reach a listener. The listener is not always able to take immediate physical action. Great example of this would be if you're driving in the car and an advertisement asks you to call a phone number or visit a website. You're not going to be able to grab your phone and take care of those things while you're driving. So it's going to be on you to remember that phone number, remember that website address, and remember to follow through on it if it's something that you as a consumer indeed want to do. There are high costs to purchase time on multiple stations in order to accumulate high levels of reach. If you're trying to impact wide general audiences, it can take a good bit of investment to be able to hit all listeners on most or all radio stations. And radio offers none of the visual or motion elements found in television. So as much as we say that theater of the mind is a good thing in terms of listener involvement, it also does not give the advertiser an opportunity to create a specific image in the mind of the listener if that's what the advertiser wants to do. So, let the deals begin. Radio found itself more visible than ever as an advertising medium after deregulation in 1996. With deregulation, we saw that radio groups were becoming larger. Corporations were taking over radio stations in markets big and small. So you were winding up with less and less mom and pop owned and operated small stations and larger conglomerates that had multiple stations in multiple markets. Jack Trout gave this advice to radio after deregulation. First, sell the medium, not your stations. Because of the fact that radio was not a big corporate entity and that it was hard for advertisers on the national level to be able to buy radio because it had to go to each individual station in each market, it wasn't a very effective tool for the national advertiser. Now that deregulation has taken place and that you can go to a station owner and potentially talk to that owner about buying ad time in several markets, now there's that possibility. But radio now has to come from that aspect of not being that friendly on the national landscape to being able to talk about the fact that they can do that, but also talking about the power of radio itself and doing that more as a selling point as opposed to promoting their individual station. Second, make the medium easier to buy. That also helped with deregulation so that you could go to one salesperson and purchase in multiple markets. Thirdly, educate the users. To do good radio, you have to understand how to use sound and sound effects. And especially for dealing with ad agencies, for example, that were used to advertising on television and visual media, trying to adapt those advertising messages for just pure sound was a bit of a challenge to advertising agencies at first. So with deregulation, we saw this paradigm shift when it came to radio. After 1996, radio consolidation and mergers of radio companies was difficult to track. It became rather fast and furious sort of event as stations were being bought up left and right, to the fact that Inside Radio, the industry trade magazine, did a regular feature called Who Owns What, trying to keep track of what stations were owned by what companies. A sample of that is in your textbook. By the end of 1998, 71.4% of commercial radio stations were in some sort of consolidated clustering. This activity was revolutionary in a business where just a few years prior, no one was allowed to own more than 2 stations in any market. So again, you have several small owners once upon a time, and those smaller owners are becoming less and less and less as corporations are now buying up many of these stations and owning as many as 8 radio stations in a given radio market. The radio network environment. There are several paradigm shifts. First, paradigm shift 1, combined forces. Various networks merged to create powerhouse networks with numerous resources. Paradigm shift 2, creating a new network where local radio stations and other production companies would form networks in and of themselves using the resources that they had. And paradigm shift 3, to own the programming that is on your network. Networks became syndicators, and syndicators became networks, so that they weren't just distributors of the programming, but they owned the programming outright that they offered to their affiliates. Now, some networks still did things the old way prior to deregulation, like ABC Radio Network, offering news and different short features. Paul Harvey was on ABC for a long, long time when he was still alive. So there were some things that still were effective to be done in the traditional way, but we definitely saw this shift in how different media outlets were starting to form and develop and merge and become bigger and have more offerings and do a lot of things within its own company. Now, the unchanging paradigm, one thing that's constant through it all, is selling network commercials. Radio network buying is generally done by the same high-level agency negotiation that buys network television. So you still have the top executives with the radio networks and with the larger corporate entities of radio that are dealing with the national ad agencies in doing a lot of buying in upfront markets and trying to get long-term contracts of a year or thereabouts, so that the agency's clients would have those stations to be able to broadcast those national spots on. The real difference between selling radio network time and selling TV network time is that the agencies have willingness to hear ideas about how to enhance a schedule at radio with value-added promotion. And so these are going to be some of the things that we've talked about in previous chapters, things like different types of promotions, contests, campaigns to create awareness for brands and businesses, all those sorts of things where there is a vested interest in a radio station audience getting equal time promotion with different businesses that support that station. And that can be a real selling point for radio, because radio, again, offers that chance to be able to do all sorts of things in that regard, working with the client to meet their needs in a rather cost-effective way and in a rather quick fashion sort of way that television can't necessarily do. So, network or syndication? Now, as we've talked about a little bit, there is kind of a blurring of the lines there. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes they tout itself as one or as the other, but the lines of demarcation are not as clear. There is a fine line between network radio and syndicated radio, because some syndicators sell commercials to advertisers, some sell programming to stations, and some do all the things. The complexity of buying syndication comes in establishing exact clearance times. So in television, where you may have clearance of commercials within a certain show or within a certain hour slot, It doesn't usually work that way in radio. Radio clearance times usually tend to run longer than the particular day part that a programming element may be played in. Now, there's going to be certain contracts where certain spots have to run within a certain defined time period or perhaps within a certain show, but there's also a lot of flexibility to be able to run those spots in larger parts of the broadcast day. A lot of times between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. or any time within a reasonable time slot surrounding a particular show. If it's an evening show or an overnight show or whatever. But there is more flexibility in what exact times those spots on a network level may run on a local radio station.